Hi everyone, Ben here, and welcome to your assessment A to Z video. It doesn't actually cover all the A to Zs. There are a few letters I couldn't think of. Anyway, as a guiding structure, it's pretty much redundant anyway, because once I got to the end of the video, I thought actually it's not the best way of structuring a video, A to Z. Anyway, a few other caveats. It's 5:30 in the morning, and both my wife and child are asleep in rooms next door, so I'm having to keep pretty quiet, so turn the volume up if you need it. Obviously, this is my view as well, my partial view on assessment that I have compiled. Therefore, it's not inclusive of everything. Using data is a separate video, obviously, and there's a number of areas I won't address and I won't cover. But this is as much as I can do. I've got 71 slides in the presentation and 40 minutes to get through this all. So let's move. Okay, my big word assessment lineup. So this is what's coming up. I'm going to use lots of big words here. Fundamentalizing, problematizing, contextualizing, conceptualizing, and embedding assessment. Fundamentalizing is like, it sounds like some kind of radicalization program. It's not, it's just thinking about what you're going to fundamentally learn, what you need to fundamentally learn. So let's start there. So what must you learn in terms of assessment, or what do at least the government say you've got to learn? Well, we actually say in your pause points, competency prompts, we say the following things: that you need to learn these different elements relating to assessment. I'm not going to read them out. You can pause the video if you want to have a look at them. And then I've kind of put together this menu which combines that, but also explicitly talks about the things that are explicit in the teaching standards and the core content framework. Pardon me, if my voice is going literally a minute into this video, I'm in trouble, but anyway. So we're going to cover things like how to embed assessment throughout your teaching and learning, the challenges and opportunities it might present, how it's linked to learning intentions or goals. We can talk about feedback, questioning, self-peer assessment, etc., etc. As I said, not all of this is covered in this video, and I would expect, oh, sorry, that's my cat. Sorry, had a heart attack there. I would expect a lot of this to be embedded within your subject studies sessions, and not just in explicit assessment related sessions, but all the way through, if we're going to successfully embed assessment throughout teaching and learning, which is kind of my argument. Okay, so that's what you've got to learn. Let's think about some of the issues, okay, that we have with traditional assessment. What are the issues? So the seminal work on this is Black and Williams, Inside the Black Box, where they explicitly did a literature and study review into assessment and its use. They posited a range of problems with so-called traditional assessment, that it was very much based around testing and grading, ticking, it was right or wrong, and it was very much encouraged what I would call norm referencing. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but comparison between students. That kind of approach encouraged, they said, rote and superficial learning. Don't need to worry too much about the primary bit, but it was all about quantity and presentation rather than quality in relation to learning. Marks and grading are overemphasized, but actually the feedback, the useful how do I improve, where do I go next, is underemphasized. Yeah, there's obviously the awarding of grades encourages competition rather than personal improvement, and teachers' feedback to pupils is serving social or managerial or administrative functions. So to be able to report on progress is prioritized over and above the learning needs of actual pupils. It's about the collation of data and what have you. So that was a stinging critique of so-called traditional assessment, and it's become a seminal and widely quoted source. Just to unpick some of the phrases that were used there, some of the terminology. We're going to use the analogy of athletics and 100-meter race. What do we assess against? Well, we talked about norm referencing, and that's all about comparison with others. So that would be, where you place within a class. Oh, I got this. What did you get? And what have you. However, as an athlete, you can, and often this comes up on the screen, when you see the performances, you see them ranked, but you'll see PB or SB, personal best or season's best, and that's called ipsative assessment, and it's something that is really undervalued and underused within education, and it's one I really, really encourage you to use, because then it's about your previous performance. Can you improve? Can you improve? What's the next step, etc. And it avoids the problems you have with norm referencing. You can combine criteria referencing with either of the other approaches. So obviously, marking or assessing a piece of work against set criteria that explicitly shared in advance. It's a bit like decathlon, which has criteria, or a world record, etc. But you can obviously end up with a grade with, even if a piece of work is against criteria, you can end up with a grade, and often they reference grades. So that's why it's not in and of itself. It depends how you use criteria referenced assessment. So there we go. Oh yeah, this is just a very quick example. You can pause if you actually want to have a go at this. You've got 60 seconds to draw a house, go. So you might just pause the video, draw a house, get a piece of paper, draw a house. Have you drawn a house? Well, you've got 60 seconds, Ben. But anyway, pause this video, 60 seconds later, come back to it. This is the marking system. So I want you to mark your house. You get a point for a window, 2 points for a garden, 2 points for a letterbox, 3 points for a chimney, 4 points for a chimney with smoke, and 5 points for a garage. Now, what's the problem with that? Number one, I didn't share it with you in advance. Number two, it's really subjective. So I'm indicating what a house is. So a house has a garage. Well, does it? My house, where I'm sat right now, doesn't have a garage. It doesn't have a chimney with smoke. It does have a garden. Only got a few windows. So, this is really partial. And actually, doesn't the provision of some success criteria or criteria actually remove the notion of creativity? Are we? We're confining learning to what is in the criteria that is inside of our imagination or inside of what have you. But actually, what about those that draw a house in ways that don't include any of those things? And are we diminishing creativity? So that's one weakness of criterion referenced assessment. Anyway, G is for grade, so we're still thinking about problematizing assessment here. So there's often a huge parental support for it because it's their way of seeing how they're doing, and parents often assume that grades are the only way to find out about that. Now, William, yeah, I mean, he says, look, we get kids hooked on grades, and I completely see this. Our entire language, often at school, in lessons repeated by teachers over and over and over and over and again, is do it because it's in the exam, or if you don't do this, you won't get a good exam result. So we're drip feeding, or explicitly, flooding them with a hidden curriculum or an explicit curriculum that absolutely values grades, and therefore students want them. I mean, how many times have you heard students talk about PSHE or pastoral elements of curriculum as pointless because they don't count? So I agree with Dillian William. That is, go and look at all of his work on assessment. He's done some great stuff. He's emeritus professor from the institute. Now, Butler's research from a little while ago says that students, well, they look at grades before comments, and then they look at other students' grades before comments. So the actual use of grades and comments completely negates the use of comments for how to improve. So should we use grades at all? Yeah, and that whole notion that the giving of grades is all ultimately for a student, for a pupil, about comparison with other, and therefore the mental energy of that student, if they haven't done very well, is about protecting themselves and their sense of well-being, their sense of self-esteem, rather than necessarily thinking, okay, where did I go wrong here? What is it that's leading me to get this kind of grade, or what have you? But even that mental thought, where did I go wrong, is an assumption that because they got a grade lower than someone else, they've gone wrong. They actually might be achieving massively, but just not attaining massively in relation to others. Their starting points may be completely different. So this Carol Dweck's work on this and growth mindsets, which I'll come on to, but a real focus on the grade and your position within the hierarchy of the class, and leads to learned helplessness. After repeatedly falling short, pupils decide that the subject is forever beyond them. And I know plenty of people, including family members, who learned helplessness, that thought, actually, this subject isn't for me, or academic study isn't for me, because I'm consistently ranking low in this hierarchy of attainment. So Cohn says never grade students while they are still learning. It has an adverse effect on their ability to continue learning. Some would say, well, actually, high achievers love the awards of grades. They love that recognition. And therefore, by not awarding grades, you're doing them down. And that's something that we will, I think, struggle to get round. But I think there are other ways round that, which we'll go on to look at. Again, Butler's research says you may as well not give the comments if the grade's there, because students either don't need to or don't want to read them. I'm not, again, sure. I think back to my own experience when I got a good piece of work. I'd really want to read the comments. I'd want to be sort of, congratulate myself. So I would read them, but potentially I can understand if there was a really problematic, no, not really problematic, what's my language, but if you've got a relatively poor grade, then you may be switched off from actually seeing why that is and what you can do to improve it. Some more problems now. Dylan Wiliam says that in schools across the country, classroom conversations are still dominated by the confident, articulate students, and this is partly because teachers, are still encouraging a hands-up system of participation in the classroom. And Wiliam, 5 years before his previous quote, says that when teachers allow students to choose whether or not to participate, for example, by allowing them to raise their hands to show they have an answer, they're actually making that achievement gap worse, because those who are participating are getting smarter, while those avoiding engagement are foregoing the opportunities to increase their ability. They are hiding within the class. Now, that's not always true. You may have very engaged kids learning and listening from the contributions of others. Ultimately, isn't that what group work does? It puts people of different abilities together, and the sharing of understanding helps to raise everyone. But in the main, if that's repeated over and over again, it's only certain people who are engaged in that conversation, then perhaps I agree. Now, I'm sorry, I'm actually confused by my own E is for evidence right at the top. But anyway, just ignore what on earth I was going on about to try and prove that everything is A to Z. Teachers are making decisions about what to do next with a class based on evidence only from the confident students. That's the issue here, is that assessment is all about getting insights into the progress and learning of all students in a given class, not just those who are verbally participating. So we need to work out ways where we can assess everyone and not just some. And, I've talked about this, the impact of grading and traditional assessment on student well-being. Here's a significant quote from Black and William. I'll just put that up. But the key is that notion of retiring hurt, avoiding investing in learning or effort in learning, because they're only getting disappointment every time. If their starting points are potentially lower, they're not able to recognise that achievement that they're getting when attainment is the key measure here. So I think that's a really significant quote. Some other issues I feel with assessment, partly that assessment is a thing that's done after teaching and learning finishes. It's separate. It's sort of, okay, at the end of a sequence, we'll assess how you got on. It's not embedded as such. And to some degree, the frameworks that sort of guide our teacher education do the same. So they separate out assessment. But hold on a minute, that's exactly what I'm doing in this video. I'm separating out assessment. So it's a problem for everyone here. To make something explicit, to highlight something, you have to separate, you separate it out. But actually, what we should be doing is looking to embed. Yeah, hence the name of William. A lot of William's work is about embedded formative assessment. It's something that isn't othered in terms of the teaching and learning process or processes. Finally, that notion of performance, that what is valued is the ability to perform or regurgitate the intended learning outcome at the end of a lesson, okay? And that's your success measure as a teacher, rather than long-term, deep-rooted learning, okay? So that notion of performance, regurgitation, let's say, but it can be so much more, at the end of a short learning sequence doesn't equate to long-term, deep-rooted learning. So we know there are some problems. Let's think a little bit more, take a step back and think about the context factors influencing the kind of assessment we see now in the classroom. What's the landscape? Okay, various purposes for assessment. Actually, I meant to delete that slide, so let's talk about this. I really like this this way of thinking about different forms of different purposes of assessment: diagnostic, formative, summative, and evaluative. I really like those. So formative, under this definition, is all about supporting learning, whereas summative is all about recording and reporting learning, what I would call, certifying learning. Blah, 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 blah. There's also some others that I might add to this: administrative, about accountability and grade production, and also assessment can provide motivation. So there's affective and interpersonal factors that I think are potentially missed, might come under formative, perhaps up there in that breakdown. A quick look at levels, which have left the school scene now, but they are significant. But between for a good 7-8 years, these influenced heavily the assessment landscape within schools, and then they were disbanded in 2014. Schools essentially were using these to sort of level a piece of work and leveling them very frequently. The QCA was the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority. They used to be the organisation that would create the curriculum at arm's length from government, but now the government just do it via the DFE. They were intended for periodic judgments, and they were supposed to be used formally in summer 2011 for end of Key Stage 3 assessment, because they covered essentially Key Stage 3. But actually 3 years later, they were on their way out. This is sort of what they look like. If you look at the bottom row just here, you'd have some levels. They'd actually go up to level 8 and then exceptional performance. So officially they covered the ages all the way through to GCSE. And what you'd get in schools is lots of this kind of stuff. So they'd be broken down. This is a pupil-friendly version of the actual national curriculum levels in a given subject. This is languages, and you'd have things. What level am I working at? What can I do at that level, and what have you? And it would sort of be a grid to help and support the assessment of pupils. But what would happen in schools? Number one, you would get subdivision. So you'd suddenly find this a lot of language about I'm level 4A, I'm level 4B, I'm level 4C, and then you get lots of managerial functions about where people should be at what time. So suddenly you've got a system which is all about reporting rather than supporting student learning. And in a sense, that's what the DFE said, that levels have become too abstract, don't give meaningful information, nor support pupils in having to improve. And in effect, the levels were just working as grades in the way that I've talked about before. And therefore, ultimately, they were disbanded. This is what they look like now. By the end of each stage, pupils are expected to know, apply, and understand the matter, skills, and processes specified in the program of study. So there we go. Obviously, we've got more focus on exams now. So in 2014, there was the removal of most coursework, or so-called controlled assessment. That's sort of coursework done at school under controlled conditions and timed. The removal of modular exams. So at the end of year 1, year 2, the end of year 1, you might have half an A level or what have you, or the AS levels were taken out. So it was a move to a single point in time exams at the end of a GCSE course. And the argument put forward for that is that this will give a more rigorous system. Exams, are tougher and provide more rigor, and they better assess the knowledge-rich curricula which were brought in at the same time. A new grading system came in, and obviously this is interesting that just one critique of this is, if grades 5 and 4 are both a pass, what's actually common parlance for a pass? Interestingly, UCL, to get onto this course, you need a grade 5, not a grade 4, or the equivalent of. So there we go. And finally, obviously, I'm going to explore this in the debate next week, but we've got teacher assessed grades, which actually have completely replaced exams for the last 2 years. And certainly external exams were cancelled because of the unequal impact of COVID-19, and tags, as I'm going to call them, saw teachers taking into account a range of student work to arrive at a grade that best summarised knowledge, understanding, and capabilities. Next week, we're going to think about the pros and cons of things like that and exams in the debate we're going to have. Okay, so let's move forward to thinking about how we might therefore conceptualise our approach to assessment. And there we go. First of all, one interesting ways of thinking about it is the different forms or the different times at which we might assess to get the big picture of how a student teacher is doing, how a pupil is doing. So whilst we might integrate assessment into our day-to-day teaching, that might not give us the whole picture of how a pupil is doing and the progress they're making. So it's important to think about it in different terms, and it therefore encapsulates a lot of different practice within the classroom. Now, I like to think of teaching as the response to 3 questions. And this is overall teaching, not just assessment. Where are students at? Where are they heading? And you'll know what's coming next. How do they get there? So I talk about check-ins, I talk about modes of transport, and I talk about destinations. And I think this is a really nice way to think about assessment, because if you think about it, assessment's involved at each stage, because you need to understand where they're at, you've got to assess them, where they're heading, you've got to clarify their destinations. That's sort of assessment, because then you're going to also see if they've got there. And then the transportation, the activities and what have you that they do, you're constantly throughout going to be assessing the degree to which they are getting there. You know, are they on track? And if you're worth your salt as a teacher, you're doing that all the time. So I think that's really key. And therefore, I completely agree with Swainwick's notion. He was talking about music, but to teach is to assess. You know, assessment should be embedded within our practice. This video here, this notion of assessment, it's not something that is awful and all about exams. It's something that is fundamental to our practice. It is assessment as teaching or learning. I'm not going to go through this quote, but ultimately, Dylan Wiliam here is saying that, look, as a teacher, you need to develop a minute, detailed understanding of how to move a pupil through your subject syllabus throughout, and by syllabus I mean, well, subject curriculum. Syllabus is too associated with exams, but subject curriculum. And you need to have a really careful, considered understanding of how to scaffold and structure that journey throughout their life at school. And actually that takes years to do. And the breaking down of that journey, that's all about being able to feed back, being able to know what next steps are, being able to know how to know where they're at, how to locate their progress and their learning so far, how to move to the next steps, how to check that understanding all the way through. So that's what we mean by embedded assessment. Now, we've got 2 terms here that we could potentially use for embedding the kind of assessment we're talking about. You've got assessment for learning on the one hand and formative assessment on the other hand. In a sense, they're synonymous these days. The old definition was that formative just meant something that didn't count towards, you know, an official grade, and summative was something that did count. And summative, to some degree, still holds that notion. You know, it counts towards a grade. It certifies learning. But formative has changed from just something that doesn't count into something more akin to assessment for learning. And the definition from earlier was that something that supports learning, that helps move learning forward. Assessment for learning itself has become less popular as a term, and it's because it's been sort of misinterpreted or reduced down, boiled down to sort of cheap techniques, which may of themselves have value. I mean, I love mini whiteboards, but the use of lollipop sticks to sort of randomly ascribe who's going to answer questions, rather than the actual focus on the learning. So as an approach, it's perhaps been unfairly criticised to some degree, but certainly there's more focus on formative assessment these days. The key thing here that in both approaches, pupils are fundamentally involved. They are not recipients of end of learning results, but they are all the way through open to and involved in feedback. I've put here, think about student teachers as learners. I think about your involvement of your progress through the PGC and your learning through the PGC. It's not that we just keep it all secret from you and only tell you at the end, or constantly just throw outcomes at you. We want to encourage you to be able to establish how you're doing and establish next steps, as well as with support from us. And the 2 key works here are Wiliam 2012 and Wiliam and Leahy's embedding formative assessment, or embedded formative assessment. And what they mean by embedded and embedding is you embed it in all of your teaching and learning, if I haven't said that enough. So fine, how do we go about it? What are the practical steps we might take? Let's think about our journey again. and we're going to think about the steps that we can make in relation to this 3-step journey. And ultimately, and this is again is William and Leahy's take, but you'll see that the same structure of my journey of learning, and we did come up with these separately, I promise, appear here. So you've got where the learner is going, where the learner's at, how they get there, and then you've got different roles for teachers, peers, and learners. And I find that a really useful approach to then think about the means of formative assessment, how you take students forward at any given moment. Let's start with checking in sort of where the student's at. So although William has where the learner's going first, I think, well, surely you need to know where the learner is, but first, before you think about where they're going. It's not just about the syllabus or what you've got to teach them. It's about, well, they might know it already. They might be able to do it already. What's the knowledge so far? What's the understanding? What are the skills at the moment? So how do we approach that? And, responsive teaching is something that's gaining more parlance, and there's different definitions of it. Obviously, we have it as one of our 3 development indicators. For me, and actually this is my new definition, it's not the one in your ADP. For me, it's the ability to seek, to actually look for, to collate, and to respond to evidence of learning, evidence of progress, evidence of problems, of misconceptions, evidence of struggle, evidence of strength, to maximize people learning, and to do so at different time periods, so minute by minute, within a lesson, lesson by lesson, week by week, etc. So that's about responding, and it's a really tricky thing to do. It's about deviating from your script, from your plan, as appropriate according to pupil need. So yeah, and it's about building learning sequences based on what students bring to the table. So it's responding right from the beginning. Instead of saying, okay, you've got to teach this now, it's saying, well, where are students at? Is this the appropriate thing to teach? And okay, where do we go from there? And in this reflective teaching book, which I highly recommend, it's one of the core texts for the course, Bloom talks about this in adjusting teaching parlance. And, going right back, Uzabel, was indicating similar, that teachers should work out what a learner knows. He was talking just about knowledge, and then teach accordingly. And of course, it makes sense. That's your start point. It's not just, okay, what are we going to teach them? Where are we going to take them? It's where are they at first? A little while ago, in 2013, developed this as actually it was called the differentiation cycle at that point in time. But essentially, there are all kinds of ways, all kinds of things you need to know about your learners before you then go and teach them, and teach them teach them flexibly according to where they're at, and what have you. So there's knowledge, learning, preferences, capabilities, interest, motivation, abilities, perceptions of their abilities, support, etc. I don't know why on earth. Yeah, don't worry about that. So how can we learn about our learners? There's lots of different ways to do it. There's lots of different information at our disposal that we can get from the school, we can get from other teachers, we can look in the past for, and there's things we can do now to ascertain where students are at prior to learning beginning. A couple of question-based approaches that I thought were quite nice to use at the start of a sequence of learning. So I quite like this approach, asking big questions which probe underpinning knowledge and understanding. There's one from science about, photosynthesis. Plants need sunlight to make food. How come the biggest plants don't grow in deserts where it's sunny all the time? I think I missed out a question mark there. But anyway, and get students to answer that individually, or perhaps in groups, or in pairs. Try and establish the underlying conceptual understanding of why that is to gain insights into photosynthesis, providing pupils with all the key terms that you're going to address in a given unit and giving them the challenge of connecting them together as steps or labels, or work out the connections between these terms. What do they know? What don't they know? What misconceptions exist? You're doing that right from the start with that approach. Or perhaps the students themselves set questions for an end of unit test or quiz that they might not ultimately have, because obviously you will need to direct that slightly. But one approach is Rothstein and Santana's question formulation technique, which is it's an entire book summarized as one page here, of students creating questions. Their book is Change One Thing, get students to create the questions, because what that does is bring ownership over learning and interest and engagement in the direction of learning as a result. And it will also give you a real insight into what they do or don't know. So I would encourage teachers to contribute to these questions, and maybe have additional ones if the focus of the questions is way out, but it certainly will tell you and give you insight into what they know and what they don't. Now let's think about where they're heading. So destinations, where you want to take them, so-called learning outcomes, learning objectives, learning goals, learning aims, learning intentions. There's lots of interchangeable words that an immense amount of time is spent trying to differentiate between the different things, but ultimately they're all destinations. They're all, okay, where are we trying to take students? Destinations versus the journey. Yeah, one thing that a good little book by Kate Jones. It's called This. It breaks down William and Leahy's approach to formative assessment. But one of the issues that she talks about is commonly teachers' language when we're planning. Our currency is all about tasks and activities. Oh, I've got to find a task. I don't know what to do with the kids. Let's get them to do this. It's not necessarily about what the outcomes of those tasks and activities, which it should be. We need to flip this. It's that whole notion that teaching's hard because it's designed backwards. You should start not with what students are going to do, but what we want them to get out of it, what we want them to learn. Yeah, we should be identifying aims, destinations, goals, objectives, outcomes first. I'm going to take you through an example of how I might present this and what I mean by the different distinguishing the two. So let's say we've got a unit of work, a sequence of learning about whether or not the UK should rejoin the EU. Let's say this is in the citizenship class. Well, at the end of that sequence, students are going to be asked to justify. Hi there, Echo. It's lovely to see you. Sorry, I've got my cat chiming in. Justify whether the UK should rejoin the EU. So that's what they're going to do, and they're going to do it in essay question format at the end of this unit. To get to that point, we're going to need to do a number of steps. We're going to do that together as a class. So before that, actually, I should have started the other way, but first of all, we're going to describe the EU and Brexit, the key terms. We're going to do that by building up our knowledge together as a class through a class thought shower. We're then going to compare and contrast the UK before and after Brexit. We're going to get some cards, and we're going to do that and sort those in pairs. Then we're going to have various key figures come and visit our classroom in the hot seat to enable us to evaluate the pros and cons of Brexit. Okay, we're going to do interviews with those experts, and then that's going to set us up. Those three different activities and outcomes are going to set us up to be able to write that essay question about whether or not the UK should rejoin the EU. But can you see what I'm doing there? I mean, first of all, I'm presenting in kind of quite an engaging way the big picture for learning, or the learning journey that we're going to go on as a class. But also, I'm absolutely differentiating between the learning intentions, learning outcomes, goals, aims, etc., and the activities. Okay, I recommend that you do this. It's a really nice way of doing so, and you can diagrammatically present it in all kinds of ways. Mountains, medals, ladders, stepping stones, etc. Now, the key thing here with communicating learning intentions is that there's some caveats, okay? You don't always know every learning outcome or destination, okay, and that's okay. There are some unintended consequences of learning, and that's fine. And actually, sometimes you don't want to share them right at the beginning. You know, it may spoil that journey, and therefore you keep it hidden and then reveal them towards the end or other junctures. And actually, the sort of rote, here are the learning outcomes for this lesson. If you begin with these at the start of each lesson, it can really lead to uninspiring learning. Certainly if it is done in a very procedural or mechanistic way. Many schools, and I hope this is done less, but many schools still ask for learning outcomes to be copied down into books. But where is the actual engagement with the content of the learning there? Hi there, Echo. How are you doing? I'm actually going to say goodbye to you. Anyway, he gets hungry at this time of day. So there we go. How can we get there? Transport the activities and the support for the activities that we're going to be, or the learning processes we're going to be engaging with. Let's think about that now and think about how assessment is associated with that. It's not just, as I say, something that's done at the end of a process. It's ongoing. So Hattie talks about rebalancing talking and listening. It's you know, the under direct instruction, the misconception of direct instruction and instructional teaching is that teachers are talking the whole time, but actually it's about rebalancing talking and listening, because the key is that you need to provide space to understand students' learning. And also, we need to be really really clear about creating a climate and a focus within the class, if you're going to rebalancing talk and listening, to enable every student to actually contribute, okay, and to be confident and comfortable in terms of contributing to the class. So we need them to be willing to make mistakes and errors and embrace those as part of the learning process. And here we're really boiling down what we value in the classroom. So it's that balance of attainment, correct answers, which you can't say don't matter, they do matter. But it's the balancing of that with the balancing of achievement relative to starting points, and ensuring that you are encouraging that at all times. And that, for me, is at the heart of what we know as growth mindsets. I'm sure you've all covered that already by the work of Carol Dweck. I'll bring back in responsive teaching. Yeah, this is about responding to evidence as soon as it appears, not just at the end. I've talked about that. You amend your teaching accordingly at all junctures of that journey, as activities are engaged with. But it's more than that. Okay, it's more than just responsive teaching, and this is what Dylan Williams says. Responsive teaching is teacher-centered and teacher-focused. In a sense, it's all about encouraging students to self-determine, okay, and to understand their own and their peers' progress, the hurdles, the strategies, etc. It's not just about you identifying those, about students self-identifying those. I'm just going to pause to cough. So now we're going to think about how we provide feedback. Well, it's a bit of a minefield. Kluger and Denisi, in another sort of meta-analysis of studies around feedback, actually said that a lot of feedback doesn't help. They said, you know, there's only in 2 out of 8 situations does feedback actually work to either increase the aspiration of pupils or increase the effort of pupils. I'll leave that up. You can pause this should you wish to understand that. But essentially, I think the key here is that it's feedback related to a goal, and actually you wouldn't necessarily always want to do that. Say, well, you know, indicate, well, you fell short of this goal. You know, you wouldn't be explicitly always doing that as a teacher. That has some of the connotations of grading. So it's about saying what the next step is necessarily, but not necessarily always indicating the degree to which they exceeded or fell short of a given goal. Here is, you know, 4 key tips for providing effective feedback. Make sure it's timely, work is fresh in the mind, you'll know when when you handed an essay and what have you. You're keen to get that that grade, no, not that grade, that feedback. Well, you probably are because it's embedded, keen to get that grade, but you're keen to get feedback because you've just done the work, you've just really committed to it. The overwhelming uh, uh, advice is to use comments and not grade explicitly. Be really specific with guidance, really explicit with guidance and next steps for how to improve, and absolutely require action. So that guidance for how to improve should require and give space for improvement, redrafting, reconsideration of things. Often that's left to chance. The EEF's Teaching and Learning Toolkit talks about feedback as being based on good evidence. It's cheap. It makes a big difference. They say, look, don't just give feedback in written form. That's gonna, be really tough for you, just logistically. Also, give feedback when things are right, not just when things are wrong. Being explicit in one's feedback may benefit lower retaining pupils, and actually you want to take a kind of scaffolded approach to the giving of feedback. So you might give teacher feedback, very explicit. That might then move to teacher questions once a student is becoming familiar with the kinds of things that they need to do to improve, patterns over time. That might move to just questions, and then to pupils probe to give their own feedback on their work. Some suggested ways forwards. William says, well, just give A grade. Students will take longer to get there, but is that a way forward? Another solution he talks about is give feedback associated with the work, and then students have to work out on strips of paper. Students have to work out which comment relates to which piece of work. A novel approach. I'm going to only talk about a few of these. I really like point 6. Okay, point 6 goes back to that notion of ipsative assessment, that actually give a plus, an equal sign, or a minus to indicate performance relative to their personal best, and no matter where you are in terms of attainment, you could continually, if you're improving achievement, get pluses. Yeah. At the same time as someone who's actually achieving A's, might get pluses or equals, or might even dip in performance. But it would look as if it would certainly, motivationally support all pupils rather than just some, and really disparaging and treading down on those that aren't, in terms of absolute grades, performing at a high level. So anyway, there we go. Finally, and I know that this video is getting on, so I will try and be quick. Let's have a quick think about some ways where we can check in continually through the learning process, because obviously this is an ongoing cycle. Where are they at? Where are they heading? How they get there? Okay, we travel down that road of learning, and then have they got there? Where have they got to? And you do that by checking in. So that's continually. The use of hinge questions is important. Checking and by hinge, that's a hinge point in a hinge moment in teaching, where you decide whether or not it is time to move on to a subsequent activity or the next learning intention. But you need to know whether or not the class are with you, and it's not just some within the class, it's all within the class. So the use of hinge questions, and then your teaching can go in a number of different directions. As a result of that, you may need to repeat elements to pair up or to group students to help repeat learning, and what have you. I think this is a really important principle, and I only got this towards the end of my subject leadership. But for me, it's the second time you test or your quiz or your check that in terms of learning, it's the key one. Okay, in terms of the demonstrating of learning, you might give a test or a quiz to a class. And often the next steps after that quiz or test are just left to chance. They're left to students to reflect on why they got um, that outcome or what have you. When actually it should absolutely inform a really considered review and learning process through multiple means prior to. So it might be going through that test. It might be modelling particular answers in that test, why things were right or wrong, and what have you, what misconceptions led to problems with that. And then you give them the same or a similar test covering similar or quiz covering similar ground. And actually, in doing so, you are absolutely solidifying and prioritizing that middle process of review and learning from the test. Yeah, and therefore it's the second time that's far more important than just doing it once and saying goodbye and whatever the outcomes are. I really like Dylan Williams, and I've misspelt his name there. Sorry, Dylan William. His 4 quarters marking approach. This does what it says on the tin. You mark a quarter of the work in detail. A quarter you skim mark. A quarter is self-assessed by pupils, and a quarter is peer assessed by pupils. Both of those, obviously, with oversight from teachers, but that's certainly a really nice way to avoid overload in terms of marking and feeding back. Now, yeah, there's a huge number of ways for teachers to check or assess whole class learning. A huge number of ways. And in fact, in the description of this video on YouTube, I'll put this, a whole PowerPoint dedicated towards this, but it has, I think, 20 different ways to assess learning of a whole class, to assess whether or not the time is right to move on. This is particularly useful for knowledge and understanding, I have to say. And some of these, the two I've starred there, the sort of traffic lights, thumbs up or down, not the best ways, simply because it doesn't actually check specific learning. It relies on student self-reporting of their understanding, which isn't the same as being able to accurately represent learning or represent their understanding. So there we go. And the link is also in this PowerPoint, which I'll also put in the description. So there we go. We have covered 5 different elements of assessment: the fundamentals, what you've got to learn, the problems, the context, the concept that I want you to take away with how embedded assessment should be within every single one of your teaching and learning practices, or maybe not every single one. Then come on, you're over egging the pudding, but you know what I mean. And then some practical steps for how to embed it. There's your references. We are done. Thanks everyone. See ya.